So the Third Republic had been established essentially by the inability of French monarchists to find an agreeable candidate for the French throne, but it actually endured a number of crises in the late 19th century that threatened its existence, and one of those crises was something that became known as the Boulanger affair. So Georges Boulange was a popular French general who had served as Minister for War during the 1880s, and that was what first brought him to public attention, especially regarding a crisis he got engaged in that involved Germany. So in 1887, something called the Schnable affair took place. You might be wondering what exactly it is. Schnable was a French police officer who was traveling to Germany on official business when he was arrested by German police. And there was a debate about whether he was arrested in France or in Germany as he crossed the border. But essentially, the German government accused Schnable of being a spy and saying that they were justified in arresting him because he was traveling to Germany to spy. And in this crisis, Georges Boulange was the most outspoken member of the French government, demanding war, essentially that France needed to go to war over this issue. In the end, the German Kaiser Wilhelm, persuaded Bismarck to back down and release Schnable. He felt that it really wasn't worth the effort of going to war with France over it. But in France, the impression amongst a lot of people had was that Bismarck had backed down from Boulange himself, that he was afraid of Boulange as this aggressive general, and that therefore Boulange was someone who was to be respected and admired. He was quickly nicknamed General Revenge, as in this is the guy who is going to strike the fear of God into the Germans and to avenge the horrible defeat the French suffered in 1870. So Boulange was still, although the French government itself was actually horrified by Boulange, and Boulange was quickly relieved of his post as Minister for War because the French government itself felt that he was a kind of war-hungry lunatic who had almost promoted war with Germany, which the French government realized Germany would not, or France would not win. However, in elections in 1887 and 1888, many people wrote down Boulange's name as a write-in candidate. Now, he wasn't eligible to actually occupy the seats because he was still in the army, and the rules were very clear. Generals were not allowed to serve in Parliament, but it showed that a lot of people were rallying to his cause, that this was a political movement that was developing around Boulange himself. And in particular, he was attracted to by conservatives found him attractive. He promised revenge against Germany, revision of the French constitution, and restoration of the French monarchy. However, Boulange also had support amongst some working class people. Boulange's great tactic was to actually be pretty vague about what he actually supported, and therefore in that way it was possible for everyone to imagine that Boulange was essentially a champion of what they themselves were interested in. The political crisis came to a head in January 1889. Boulange had been fired from the army, he'd been dismissed from the army, which was something of a mistake because it then allowed him actually run for office. He had planned to put his name forward for every electoral seat in France in 1889, which would have essentially, he felt, been a referendum on whether he should be a military dictator or not. The French government changed laws very quickly to prevent him from running in all seats. But nevertheless, he was elected by an overwhelming majority as Deputy of Paris in 1889, and it seemed he was about to stage a military coup. It seemed that certainly if he did so, he would have had a lot of support in the army, a lot of support in sections of French society to become a military dictator. But Boulange himself hesitated and figured it was better to try and wait to legitimately take power. And over the next couple of months, the government began to build a case against him for treason. And when Boulange learned about this in April 1889, he fled the country, fled to England. Whether the government actually could have charged him with treason or not was a different question. So he fled the country. Then he was charged with treason in his absence. And he eventually committed suicide on the grave of his mistress in Brussels in 1891. So the Third Republic survived, but the Boulange affair has shown that really it wouldn't have taken all that much effort for military dictatorship to emerge once more. So perhaps its democratic foundation was not as strong as people might have liked. an even bigger crisis in France in the late 19th century is what is known as the Dreyfus Affair, or still to this day in France is simply known as the affair. And this really demonstrated the tension between France's liberal politics and its ethnic nationalism, its sense of what it means to be French and how Frenchness was defined. So the case began in 1894. A guy called Alfred Dreyfus, pictured here, was a French army officer. And it became known to the French officials, the French military, that there was someone in the French army selling secrets to the Germans and selling secrets to the German embassy in Paris. The investigating officer, a guy called Henri, came to believe it was Dreyfus, and probably genuinely believed that Dreyfus was guilty of selling secrets. Henri forged evidence to make it to essentially support the fact that Dreyfus was the source of these leaks to the German embassy. Dreyfus was convicted and sent off to a place called Devil's Island off the coast of French Guiana, a miserable malarial hellhole where he suffered horribly for the next 4 or 5 years, unaware that his case actually had led to a national scandal back in France. Dreyfus, of course, was also Jewish, and when the media learned, because originally he was supposed to be tried in secret, when the media learned that a Jewish officer had allegedly betrayed the French nation, it led to a surge of anti-Semitism in France, and many people called for Dreyfus's execution. Of course, Dreyfus himself was not actually guilty, and over the next couple of years it became obvious that whoever was selling these secrets to the Germans was still selling them, i.e. it could not have been Dreyfus who was guilty. And more and more evidence came out that Dreyfus was not responsible for this, that someone else, in fact, officials came to believe a guy called Esterhazy was the person leaking information to the Germans. But the crux of the issue became this. So even as evidence emerged that Dreyfus was completely innocent, many people, certainly in the French army, but even in French society in particular, and especially on the political right amongst French conservatives, that the honour of the French army could not be tainted by the fact that essentially had made a mess of this investigation, had convicted the wrong man, and had allowed the guilty party to continue selling war secrets. In other words, the honour of the army should not and could not be threatened by this national disgrace, and therefore, in order to protect the integrity of the army, Dreyfus had to remain in prison, and his conviction had to stand. And to the point in which the army offered defence of a libel for Esterhazy against those who accused him publicly of being guilty of selling secrets, which he definitely was. The crisis came to a head in 1899, and particularly it was pushed forward by a guy called Émile Zola, a French novelist. He wrote a very famous article in a French newspaper called L'Accuse, where he basically laid out step by step why Dreyfus wasn't guilty and how various members of the French military had participated in a cover-up to hide his innocence and to ignore doing a proper investigation of the actual criminal, which was Esterhazy. It produced a storm in France, which split France down the middle between those who argued that democracy, justice, liberalism, these are important things. These must be defended even in the face of a humiliation for the army, i.e. Dreyfus must be released. And those who insist that the honour of France's national army and the French national integrity must be upheld, and the fact that Dreyfus was Jewish, i.e. meant he wasn't really fully French, and therefore his guilt was almost more acceptable from that point of view because the fact he was Jewish and not of a Catholic background. In the end, the scandal forced the military to remove Dreyfus from Devil's Island, bring him back to France and put him on trial once again. Dreyfus had no idea all this had taken place in his absence, and incredibly he was convicted again, even though the armour officer who had forged the evidence against him had committed suicide and admitted he had forged the evidence. But Dreyfus was offered a plea, or he was offered a pardon if he admitted his guilt. He was absolutely broken from the 4 or 5 years he had spent in Devil's Island, so he agreed to a pardon. But it wasn't until 1906 that the French state fully exonerated Dreyfus, and he was cleared of all charges and restored to a position in the army. But it showed just how the kind of ethnic tensions and the kind of liberal values of France clashed in the case of the Dreyfus affair, and realigned forces on the political left and right in France, and showed that anti-Semitism and a kind of nasty strain of French nationalism was alive and well in French politics. That being said, there were efforts to reform France politically over the course of the late 18th century or late 19th century, including connected to its religious values. In the 1880s, the French government had begun actively sponsoring free and mandatory education for all French children. Now, the idea of new free universal education for French children, that was not totally new. That had existed, at least in theory, in one form or another dating back to the French Revolution. But it wasn't until the emergence of the Third Republic, it wasn't until the French state became willing to invest in the resources to pay teachers, to construct schools, that this really became a reality. So it's not until the late 19th century that universal education for all elementary age school children begins to take place. In particular, the Third Republic placed a strong emphasis on encouraging patriotism amongst children and not encouraging religious values. So prior to the 1880s, the Catholic Church had a big influence on the education in France. The Third Republic sought to make education much more secular, to remove religious agents from teaching positions, and to instead use secular, committed Republicans as teachers instead. So they promote patriotism, they promote secularism, and how they actually promote patriotism in particular was by teaching geography and history. You might sound obvious, but geography and history were not on the French curriculum until the late 1880s, and this was a way in which, by stressing the history of France, stressing the geography of France, they could re-emphasize in some ways the image of France as having always been a united, secular, republican country, which, as we've seen in our study so far, it certainly was not always. They also promoted patriotism by encouraging the French language. About a quarter of school children in the late 19th century didn't speak French as their first language. Many of them didn't speak French in any form. And so the schools became a place in which the French language was particularly emphasized, oftentimes to the detriment of the local language. And France was actually, in the 19th century, a linguistically pretty diverse place. There were parts of France where people spoke some German, where they spoke Flemish, where they spoke Breton, which is a language totally unrelated to French, where they spoke Basque, Catalan, a variety of different languages. The schools were the place where essentially all languages were banned except from French, to promote French unity or French language across France itself. The military was also another institution that promoted linguistic and a sense of unity as well. Firstly, in order to advance in the military, you had to be able to read and write in French, so it encouraged people who wanted to get ahead to read and write in French. But military service, again, in theory, had always been mandatory for everyone for a 2-year period. It wasn't until the Third Republic that was universally enforced. And so every Frenchman spent a period of time in the French army, and that helped reinforce their sense of commitment to the French nation itself, especially, taking part in ceremonies where they, raised the flag, lowered the flag, folded the flag, and also meeting people from various different parts of France, emphasizing the fact that there was a common united French identity. Meanwhile, events such as the Dreyfus Affair had convinced liberals and Republicans that the Catholic Church still had too much sway in France and more needed to be done to undermine its efforts. And most obviously, this was the formal separation between church and state that was introduced in 1905. What did this mean? Essentially, it was a revocation of the old Concord that Napoleon had signed with the Vatican in 1801. So church-state payments to the clergy were ended. Property that belonged to the French state, which had been loaned to the Catholic Church in various capacities, was retaken back into state hands. An inventory was taken out of all church property, which many people assumed meant the government was out to confiscate that property, although it didn't confiscate the property that belonged to the church itself in the end. Many religious schools were closed that had depended on some state funding. They were closed down. And essentially there was a strong emphasis placed on going forward. The French state would in no way or form support the Catholic Church. So France, as in Britain, had become more liberal over the course of the 19th century, although France was actually much more aggressive in creating a clear separation between French state and the Catholic Church by the end of the 19th century.